Hello everyone, this is Ray Konopka, and in this session I'm going to be talking about sending custom data using CodeSite. So real quick, I want to provide a quick overview of some of the different data elements, data types that are supported in CodeSite. But then the key though is how can we extend CodeSite to handle formatting data that doesn't necessarily have a predefined representation. When we're talking about a string or a date time, we know how those need to be displayed. Same thing for an integer, even properties of an object. There's a defined way to present that. But certain data elements, data structures, are much more free formed. You have a record of information, a data set record, or just a standard struct or a rect. How do we display that in an appropriate way? Well, CodeSite provides the tooling available to customize the way that information is displayed inside the viewers. And it's all driven by the send custom data method and then a formatter class, either a T-CodeSite formatter descendant or an implementation of the iCodeSite custom data interface. So to send data in CodeSite, there's the traditional send method. It's overloaded. It handles all kinds of data types. So simple messages and data types like number, strings, dates, and times. Straightforward. But you also have built-in support for complex data types like string lists and object properties and even collections of items. There's also content specific send methods like file contents and system information or version information from the executable, registry keys, and so forth, XML data, etc. However, in a the default presentation of all of that is managed by the inspector pane. So we send over a message string, it's got some content, we see the message in the message pane, and we also see the details that are associated with that message. And there's 4 stock inspector types that are available: text, properties, hierarchy, tree structure, and table, a grid. There's also custom inspectors for certain features like the collection, selecting each item of the collection and getting the property grid for each of those is a custom inspector. The image, you do a screenshot or capturing a bitmap, that's a custom inspector as well. So what we're looking at in this session is how can we leverage the stock inspectors and change the way certain data types are displayed inside a CodeSite. So let's first start with a test app that gives us some context. And so I have an application here, and the full source for the app is included in the download link that will be displayed at the end of the session. I'm just focusing on this sending the data tab right now, and it's a database, data editing type of control. I've got my navigator, I've got a number of different fields, I've got a client data set that's populated some statistics from the 2015 Chicago Cubs season. I am based in Chicago, so that is my team. So I've got, let me go ahead and run this, and then we'll see what we can do. So I'll go ahead and send some messages, and we've got the viewer coming up here, and the information we got sending some custom data. Again, the traditional thing, sending a list of all the font values. We can see that, how many fonts I have on the system, object name value grid. All of that stuff is pretty straightforward. Of course, you can resize your view as necessary. So here is to send over the controls for a given form. This is the parenting hierarchy, and so this shows the tree structure, the hierarchy inspector that's built in. So here's an example: the color inspector, the image inspector as well. It supports stretching and scaling. Here's the collection inspector. And then here's even file, the XML data inspector. So I've got an XML file, and I can control that either into the structure pane or I can change that back into the syntax highlighting. So these are all features built in. But there's two features. There's the CodeSite DB Tools unit that you can add to your project. And when you do that, there's two custom formatters that are provided by default in that unit. One is for sending a record and the other is for sending the data set. So I'm on a current record, and by logging it, I can actually see in a name value grid, properties grid, all the fields and values for that particular record. If I navigate to a different record, send the record again, I get a new set of data. And so it has all the different statistics for that. The data set actually sends out the entire data set, and the viewer will automatically size all the columns so that it's fully visible. And I've just expanded the view to only show the inspector pane, and so we can see all the data that's on that data set. Now, would you do that for a million record table? Absolutely not. You could, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to get that much structure. But for lookup tables and things like that, you want to get capture that, by all means, go ahead and send that data to CodeSite. So that principle of how that's supported is really what we're going to be talking about next. Before I show the implementation of how to build our own custom formatter, let's take a look at just what is done for using the data set and the record version of it. And specifically, we're just doing a send call, but specifying a certain message type. So the message type is what connects a given CodeSite statement to a given formatter. And in this case, we're passing a client data set or any data set in as the third parameter, but based on what message type we use, that's controlling the output. And we're going to see how to build our own and how we register the custom formatters and so forth. And then where that is available, those two, the data set and the record, are defined inside CodeSite DB Tools. So if you add both of those to your uses clause, you're good to go. You can just start using it. So let me go back to my slides and give us some more context about these custom formatters. So there's two ways, as I mentioned earlier. We can create a CodeSite formatter descendant class, and this is good for just arbitrary data types where I don't necessarily have a class that I can define an interface to go along with it, but maybe I just want to provide some extra ways of formatting things. There is no data set record, for example, that I can apply an interface, so the CodeSite formatter descendant works really well for that. However, there are situations where I've got a class, I want to extend it to tell CodeSite, if you are dealing with this particular class, the interface implementation will describe how it gets presented. So either way, the steps that follow are pretty much the same. We're going to define a new message type to associate the message type that's used to define how to do the send to which formatter is used for that. We need to specify the inspector type. How do we want the data to appear in the inspector pane? Register or format the data so that it looks appropriately. Register our custom formatter. That's if you're using a CodeSite formatter class. If you're using the interface implementation, you don't need to do that. And then call send custom data, or in certain situations where if it knows the mapping from the number, you can just call send. So to define a new message type, we would do this for your CodeSite formatter to register with the CodeSite manager so that any CodeSite logger will know how to format the data. It's also used, while I'm not explaining it or highlighting it in this particular session, but it is possible to define your own custom inspector, which is not one of the stock ones, but it can be a custom display of your choice. And that would be a case where you would need to define a new message type to bind to that custom inspector. And that would also be true in the interface implementation if you needed to do that. And then, of course, if you need to have a constant for that, you have to define the message constant. And usually that's in the unit that defines your formatter. So the inspector type, the default for the CodeSite formatter is iStock text, meaning it's just a text display, however you want that to appear. You can override the inspector type function to return back one of the following values: stock text, properties, hierarchy, table, or custom if it is something indeed a pure custom inspector. To format the data, we override the format data method, and there's two functions that we can use to populate our custom data. We'll use add line and add name value pair. Add name value pair is used for the properties inspector type. If it's any of the other ones, you would do an add line. And then for the interface implementation, there is a get formatted data method that if you're in the VCL, it gives you access to a string list parameter. If you're on .NET, you would be getting a string builder parameter for that. And then once you've defined your formatter, we now need to register that with the CodeSite Manager. And so here's an example that I'm going to be showing in just a moment. It's registering a player summary formatter with this new message type called CSM for CodeSite Message Player Summary. And again, that's done at the CodeSite Manager level, so all of your loggers have access to it. Then to actually do the send, it's send custom data, and we can give it the message type that was used to register the formatter, so it pulls up the right one. And otherwise we pass an object that supports the iCodeSite custom data interface, and it will do the formatting through there. So I've got examples of both different approaches, and the rest of the session really is just looking at the code to see how we accomplish all that. So let's switch over to our test application again, and I'm going to bring this back up. And if we look at our custom text and properties, there's nothing really listed in here at this point, but let me go ahead and run it, and we can see what this second page does. So I have a send players button, and what it's designed to do is deal with these records. So I have defined a record that represents a baseball player, and it's got a variety of properties associated with it. And when I go ahead and let me bring up my viewer and go ahead and click on that button, and I can see that I have 4 items that show up in here. The first one is showing a text representation of that record. So I've taken the first and last name, whether or not they're an all-star, and position, what their salary value is, games played, and so forth. Jake Arrieta is a pitcher, and so he actually gets a different display. Even though it's the same record type, you can do some interesting things in your formatters appropriately. Chris Bryant, he's got a name value grid, a property grid that's used to display his information, with his stats being encompassed into a nested property. And again, we have complete control over how this appears. John Lester's another pitcher, so he has a little bit more statistics that show up, including his wins and losses and ERA. So let's take a look at how this particular one is accomplished. So if we look at send players, all that's being done is I've got a baseball player record, which happens to be over in the baseball players unit, which is what I showed before in the screenshot there. And I've set up the different property values for that record, and I'm using send custom data. And the first 2 are sent over using player summary. I provide the first and last name and then the actual record to highlight it. The second two are sent using the CSM player details message type. So what do both of those do? How does that control it? Well, that's all defined in the baseball player unit, also included in the distribution here. The message types are just constants based off a CSM user. And CSM user is for your user-defined constant values. So they're not going to collide with anyone else. They're not going to collide with any of the standard message types that CodeSite uses. But it does give us the ability to, one, register a custom formatter or multiple formatters with a given type that we can then use. So let's look at the summary formatter first. It's a direct descendant of CodeSite formatter, and we're overriding these three methods. So inspector type is simply an IT stock text. The format data is really where the work is, and it's not all that much. You get an untyped data parameter. Since we know we've designed this for the record type, we're going to typecast that to a T-baseball player, and then use the add line function or method to add in the various blank lines and extracted values and formatting the object inspector or the inspector pane in CodeSite to be what we want that content to look like. And then you can also provide a type name to tell exactly what type that is. The type name shows up when we select something and we pull up the bottom page. There is a type name property that tells us that this is indeed a T-baseball player, which is nice if you have different objects that may look the same and are different types. Your formatter can handle that. So that's the standard text player summary version. The player details version returns a different inspector type, the IT stock properties, and it formats it using the add name value pair function instead of add line. And here we're just adding in all the pairs that we want. To do that nested capability that I showed, that is all driven by using the dotted notation. So in the name of the property, the value, if you have a dot there, the leftmost portion becomes the outer property level. Everything else that's specified after it is a nested level inside the object inspector. So it's a really nice way to group content together in your grid. And then the last piece is that, yes, it's also a T-baseball player since it's designed for the same record type. And again, there's not much in this unit, but the final piece is to register our two formatters with the CodeSite manager so that any logger can use either of these two message types and have the right formatter be used when CodeSite extracts out the data and logs it. So that's the first example of our custom formatter. Let me go back to our main form and switch over to the custom hierarchy, which is it's similar in structure, but it's a little bit different because it's a little bit more involved. And what we'll find, the first example here is doing a traditional CodeSite send for the items of the tree view, the TLV MLB standings tree view. And the second one, we're actually using a custom formatter, CSM tree nodes, with the same structure. And we're going to see what the difference between the two is. So let's go ahead and run this. Click on our third tab, and let's bring up our viewer. We'll click on the tree nodes and the formatted tree nodes, and what we'll find is that the first one has nothing in it. Well, that's not all that surprising because the tree nodes, it has no published properties. There's nothing to automatically extract from it. But by building a custom formatter, we can actually extract all the content in the tree view and actually represent it as a tree view of its own inside the inspector pane. So let's see how we accomplish that. So that is also associated with the project is a CS custom formatters unit that defines two new message types, tree nodes and list items. We'll cover list items in a moment, but the tree nodes looks very similar to what we did for the baseball players, except now this is for a tree view structure. So let's go into the implementation. It's a hierarchy, so now we know that we're going to have nestings and hierarchical levels, and the way we specify that is through the tab character. So for each indent level you want to display, you add a tab character at the beginning of the line. So we still use the add line function, except we're now adding the number of tabs that represents the level to which you're in the tree structure. And so again, this is just standard. Tree nodes comes back in, we iterate through all the nodes and then extract the text out of that, prefix the number of tabs to represent the index level, and the inspector pane shows the correct content. Again, the type that comes back is a tree nodes, so pretty straightforward. Being able to customize the data and get something very rich in our inspector. So moving on to our next example is the interface version. So again, let me go and run the application, and we'll go to the last page, and here I've loaded in some various Cubs baseball players and their statistics for the regular season. And again, if I pull up my viewer just so that we can see it happening, we send the list view over. So that's the Cubs stats with the properties, and then we send over the formatted version. What do we get different? Well, the Cubs properties, because it's the list view itself, it has all of the properties for the list view. However, it doesn't know how to extract out the individual items or do anything beyond that. But if we really wanted to see the content, we can use our custom formatter. And here we've extracted all of the list view data and sub items in order to display this as a table inspector. Now the nice thing about this one is that it's actually using the interface implementation for CodeSite custom data. So if we look at the calling part of it, we're doing a send, passing it the list view club stats. And then the second one, though, is we're using send custom data using the same method. Now when we do that, it looks for the CodeSite custom data interface implementation, and if it's present, it will actually go ahead and run that. Well, where's that implemented? Well, in order to implement the interface, you have to have a class in order to bolt that onto. And so where I do that is the list view that's created there is a dynamic one that's a TRK list view. I've created a descendant of the regular list view and added in this interface type. So the formatting itself, when you're implementing the interface, is in the get formatted data call that takes a string list. And then inspector type, message type, and type name are pretty much the same as we've seen before. So with respect to the list view, I'm taking that data, getting the formatted data through the going through the columns, and this is what I'm going to iterate through my structure, which is the columns is actually a property of the list view. So I need to add the header column, so that's where I rip through and get all of those and add that line, and each column is separated from the others with a tab character, so that ensures that everything gets displayed and grouped correctly. Then for the remaining items, I display a line that represents the row in that grid. And so I'm using the caption to get the first column, and then I iterate through all the sub items to build up a string that represents that whole row in my table structure. So again, not very long, very simple to add in. And then the final two pieces is, or three pieces here, I'm providing the inspector type, which is a stock table. So I want the grid. I don't have to specify a custom message type because I'm not defining a custom inspector, which again is beyond the scope of this session. And I am using the class name to return back the type name simply for clarity. So that's what will show up as the TRK list view. Pretty straightforward. Again, there's no registration necessary because of the interface implementation for it. But it is very cool to be able to see the grid structure of your data simply by passing that functionality along. So that is all the material that I have prepared for this session. So it should give you a good handle on sending custom data through CodeSite. And again, you can extend it in a variety of different ways, whether it's hierarchical data or grids and so forth. It's really nice to be able to take a custom data structure and see it in a more appropriate manner when you're analyzing your CodeSite logs. So with that, I will wrap up the recorded presentation and now join you all in the live Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Ray, for another great presentation on this time CodeSite.
You're welcome.
So there's a few questions that are coming here. One of the first which is, does CodeSite still require an external application to be running for logging to work, or can it be sent directly to a file?
It does support, or does require in most cases, the use of the CodeSite dispatcher to do the routing of the messages. That's going to change in the future. In the meantime, it is possible to use the on-send message event handler that each logger has to take the incoming message and write it directly to a file. There's an add-on unit that can be used to do that. It's not an ideal solution simply because you have to do each individual logger that you use, but it does allow you to get around not having the dispatcher, at least temporarily.
Okay. Can the CodeSite log files be encrypted?
Not at this point, but the architecture does allow for that capability. Right now, they do support being compressed. Each message can be compressed, and essentially it's obfuscated, but encryption is definitely something that we're looking to add in the future. Technically, you could encrypt the data that you're logging, encrypt it, and then convert it into a encoded string and log that, and then you would be responsible for decrypting it when you analyze the log file. But it's not. There's no service built in to encrypt the entire log.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there support for any type of resolving memory logging that can be size-based, so that the log could potentially be extracted in an exception handler?
Not in memory. I mean, you can do that in the log file sizes. You can restrict the size for that so that only the most recent data is recorded. It's definitely an enhancement that's come up in the past, and we'd love to be able to introduce that in a future version.
Okay. Someone's asking where CodeSite is in Rad Studio 10 Seattle. It's installed as a add-on, I believe, at the end. It's on the start menu after Shipboard, isn't it?
Where's CodeSite? In the Delphi 10? Well, it's a separate install, so I'm not sure exactly what question's being asked there.
Okay, maybe that's. Is there a maximum number of messages or log file size that CodeSite has for the log?
Yes, if there's when you set up the destination for the log file, you can specify a max size and a max parts, and that allows you to control how big the log file gets. It is based on size, not message number. And then when the next message gets saved to that file that exceeds that maximum size, a new part is created. And if you have a max parts value set, then the oldest part gets deleted, and you keep, say, the most recent, n number of parts.
Okay. Any possibility of using enhanced RTTI so that records can be sent without having to use custom messages?
Yes, that is certainly a possibility.
Okay. Thomas says that he's using CodeSite, but he always is impressed by all the possibilities that he never gets around to using when he sees you demonstrate it.
Excellent. That's why I do the demonstrations. There's there's lots of little things here and there and different techniques. And again, there's so much more that can be done. Robert's brought up a number of excellent points, and hopefully all of those things and more will be addressed going forward.
How would we handle the inspection of arbitrary JSON data in CodeSite based on your presentation?
Well, there's a couple different ways to do that. I'm trying to remember. I did a CodeRage session, I think it was last year or the year before, where I actually used a class helper to send JSON data over. And it uses essentially the same technique, except that it added a send JSON method to the CodeSite logger class. The principle is essentially the same. It's getting the data, interpret it, put it into a format that CodeSite recognizes, and send it. However, the next version will have a send JSON function in it, just like we have a send XML function today. So once that comes out, then you'll have that availability.
Okay. Can we use a T-custom formatter for JSON data today?
Certainly, you could.
What's the main difference between the one that comes with Delphi and the CodeSite Studio version?
So there's several things that are different. The biggest, the most notable change from a developer's point of view is the types of data that you can log. So the CodeSite Express supports basic data types, your dates, times, integers, strings. It does support objects, but that's about it. Image supports registries, version information, collections, XML data, custom data, all requires the Studio Edition, the enhanced functions and interfaces. And then there's also the remote capabilities. So sending your log messages from one machine to another is only in the Studio Edition. Those are the major ones. There's some others. There's like high performance timer capability that's only inside the Studio Edition. There's a trace method function which allows you to make one call and get timing information on the method calls that you make and so forth.
So one thing I liked about CodeSite is that when I'm using the Express version, I don't feel like it's crippled. It's like, wow, this is great. And then you go look at the Studio version, you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know I needed all these features, but these are great.
Well, that was one of the things that we wanted to do from the get-go is we didn't want the Express version to be a demo. We didn't want it to be something that's like, oh, that's cute, but I'm never going to use it. It needed to be fully functional and provide real value. But then if you want more and you get into it, the Studio really has a lot of capabilities.
Yeah. CodeSite Express install is in Get It. Okay, that's right. So yeah, it's a separate install. Go to Get It to get it. I was like, no, it's there, but I can't remember where it was at. So Let's see. I think there's a couple of questions about pricing and the BOGO offer and stuff like that. You definitely talk to sales on those. I never get them right. If I think I understand them, then that means I don't. Plus, with our resellers and stuff like that, it can be different based on where you're at. So, okay. If there's any other questions for Ray about CodeSite, how to do custom data, go ahead and put it in the Q&A window now. I think we've got most of these answered here. Okay. Well, I think we've got to the end of the questions, Ray. Thank you so
Great.
much for your time. And
No problem at all.
I think are you coming back in tomorrow or are you done now?
I am done in the Object Pascal track. I am now going over to the C++ track for the same session, but for C++ developers.
Oh, fun. Okay. Well, thank you for being here and for taking part in CodeRage.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you around.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.